we need to conserve our surroundings for our own well-being. And that's the motto, that's the only thing we focus on. And my association with horseshoe crab is way older than even nature mates, because during my school days I used to read a lot of comics, and there was a character called Bud Shire, who and his friend Billy, who were instrumental in saving the horseshoe crabs of Delaware Bay, where where some bad people were destructing their habitat and taking lots of blood from them. So it was amazing thing that a species that I am absolutely unaware of at that particular time. So I was very keen to know it, from some direct source. And then I met Shati sometime 2 3 years back, 3 years back I think, and came to know that she is working with horseshoe crab in Sundarbans. I have seen horseshoe crab in Sundarbans, but I was thinking that it was the same thing, the limulus, in our country. I have no idea that we have so many species, 5 living species, and out of five, two are actually found in our state, in our Sundarbans itself. And from the species I came to know about this, horseshoe crabs are species that is evident in Delaware Bay, mostly in the eastern coast of America and all, Northern America. So I am really, really looking forward to hear this webinar from you, Russell, and we'll definitely love to keep supporting Shati the and the work on horseshoe crab in the near future, as well as we would like to do some questionnaire surveys, some other correcting things which can actually help us save the horseshoe crab of Sundarbans and in West Bengal as a whole, and in India as a whole in the long run. And definitely, Russell, I would like to invite you in India sometime when the things are well settled, so that we can go to the field, we can look for horseshoe crab together in Sundarbans. So it's up to Shati now. Shati, you please introduce Russell and the webinar topic, and then we'll start the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Arjun sir. So good morning, everybody. A very happy Horseshoe Crab Day to you all. On this occasion, I am glad to introduce all to Russell Bicknell, who has been working on horseshoe crabs for many years now. Russell is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of New England in Australia. He has two main avenues of research. One is uncovering patterns of predation during the Paleozoic, and second is understanding fossil and live horseshoe crabs. He is particularly passionate about finding ways to combine traditional systematic paleontology with geometric morphometric analysis to uncover evolutionary patterns exhibited by horseshoe crabs. He has also recently developed an interest in using these data and patterns to support the conservation of these iconic animals. Besides the horseshoe crabs, there is another animal that Russell loves a lot. Those are cats. He has a cat to accompany him when he is not in field with horseshoe crabs. I am also privileged to have worked in collaboration with Russell on abnormal individuals of mangrove horseshoe crabs from the Indian Sundarbans. So without further delay, I would request Russell to take over and present his presentation for today on horseshoe crabs past and present using paleontology to inform modern conservation efforts. Russell, it's up to you now.
Okay. First and foremost, thank you to our lovely presenters there for not only opening this really auspicious day for horseshoe crab research, but also giving a fairly nice introduction to who I am. Before I forget, so two things. Firstly, my cat may actually turn up. And if she does decide to make an appearance, being the princess that she is, she will swan in and probably get in the way of the camera. So apologies in advance for that. And the other point is more to for your enjoyment of this presentation. I am a New Zealander, so I'm born in the very far corners of this globe. And as a result, unfortunately, the speed at which I speak sometimes gets a lot quicker. So if during my talk today, I end up getting to a point that you can't understand me, if you'd like me to slow down, just put a message in the chat and I have it open here so I can't ignore that. And I will adjust the speed at which I'm speaking. So with that in mind, I may start my screen share if that is all well and good. There we go. Cool. And I'm going to move that over. So can everyone see this? I'm guessing yes.
Yes.
Cool. Awesome. Fantastic. So a little bit about where we're going to go here today. So the title of the talk is Horseshoe Crabs Past and Present, using paleontological or paleontology to inform modern conservation efforts. As a I suppose introduction to who I am a paleontologist, first and foremost, which is probably a little bit strange to be talking about conservation, but it's through paleontology that I discovered my passion for understanding modern organisms. Traditionally, or at least during my training, during my PhD, I would have considered myself an invertebrate paleontologist. So someone who studies arthropods mostly. Arthropods, of course, as we all know, are those animals that have jointed legs, commonly have some kind of exoskeleton, and basically fill every niche in the modern ecology that we can really think of. Of course, at one point in time, arthropods were a lot more fierce than they are today. And actually, my research started during, as Swati very accurately mentioned, during the Paleozoic. So the Paleozoic is a period of time spanning from the Cambrian to the end Permian. The Cambrian is a time period where life basically decided to just go nuts and do something. Life was like, okay, I'm gonna evolve and do random stuff and try and develop effectively some kind of what we would consider to be modern ecosystem. And that sort of extended through until the Permian, which is the largest mass extinction that Earth has ever had. 95% of all marine organisms got destroyed. And that really set the tone for the modern ecosystems that we see during the Mesozoic and then into the most recent time period. Now, the reason why I started in the Paleozoic is because arthropods were so prevalent there. They were so abundant. Vertebrates didn't really take off until the Devonian, so sort of halfway through the Paleozoic. So there was a really long period of time in which arthropods were really the dominant force on Earth. And so if I want to understand how or where arthropods have come from, this is kind of the ideal time period to be looking into. I was also particularly enamored in this period of time referred to as the Cambrian explosion. This is the term that we use to describe the rapid evolutionary diversification of animals at the dawn of complex life. In the Cambrian fossil record, there's basically nothing in terms of animals, and all of a sudden, there's really beautifully diverse marine ecosystems that look different to what we see today. But if you look purely at what places in the trophic web these animals are filling, they basically look like modern ecosystems. Now, during this, my PhD, I was very fortunate to be introduced to horseshoe crabs. I was originally a part of my assigned project, but the taxonomy and understanding of horseshoe crab evolution didn't really hit me until I want to say about 3 years ago, 2018. And I became really interested in understanding how horseshoe crabs survived. These are animals that have a fossil record that extends as far back, if not further than 480 million years. They are animals that have survived 5 mass extinctions. They're animals that have experienced some beautifully diverse changes in shape, size, life mode. And as such, I think that reality is, and that concept is what really made me interested in understanding them more. Now, through the lens of wanting to understand where they have come from, and being interested in understanding how they have been injured, admittedly because I wanted to understand how extinct animals could have been injured, I came to realize it was important to use injuries to understand how we can help these animals that have survived for so long, but are now getting close to the precipice of a human-driven extinction event, which frankly is horrible to think about. So a lot of what I'm going to talk to you today about is basically sort of a talk through horseshoe crab evolution across most of the Phanerozoic. So the Phanerozoic is the last 500 million years of life. And then going to close in on what we see today in modern systems in the context of injuries, and then how we can use these injuries to inform what we need to do to really help these animals survive. All right, so start off with, these are the 4 extant horseshoe crabs. So we have Carboniferous on the far left here. We have Tachypleus tridentatus and gigas here. And over here we have the lovely American horseshoe crab, probably one of the most well-studied horseshoe crabs on Earth, Limulus polyphemus. For our Indian colleagues, of course, you guys will probably have interacted at some point with these 3, probably most likely Carboniferous, unless you have been to the States, in which case you may, of course, have seen Limulus. So if we want to look at the geographic distribution of modern and extinct horseshoe crabs, this is kind of what things look like. We have Limulus, which is basically has over here, which has its geographic distribution spanning most of the east coast of the States, and then a little bit of sort of Mexico, Central America. Over on the other side of things, of course, we have our Tachypleus tridentatus, which extends all the way up into Japan, and then has a really lovely distribution across China into Indonesia. Now, coincidentally, in this realm as well, we see Carboniferous and Tachypleus gigas that are effectively distributed in and amongst themselves. Depending on where you look, you're going to see an increased abundance of the respective genus and species. But along India and into Indonesia, you see both of these animals. Work that I've done with Swati has assessed Carboniferous in the context of it being a mangrove horseshoe crab, and understanding the patterns of injuries that these animals have incurred, which I'll discuss later. Now, to take the next step into the paleontological record, we also have a really nice distribution of fossils and trace fossils. Now, trace fossils, for those who don't know, are basically if you step foot in sand, your foot leaves a footprint. In paleontological research, that footprint can sometimes be preserved, saved within the fossil record. And that can give us information that certain animals, in this case humans, were wandering around in certain parts of the world. Now, for horseshoe crabs, there are burrowing traces and walking traces that are very, very distinct to horseshoe crabs. They're not seen by, not made by any other modern animals. And it's fair to assume that because they aren't made by any other modern animals, they probably weren't made by any other animals in the fossil record at all. So we do sometimes see evidence for horseshoe crab trace fossils in the fossil record that tells us that even though we don't have the actual physical body fossil, which is to say the actual animal, we do sometimes have evidence for the fact that they were living in certain places. The fossil record, the body fossil record, it is especially prevalent in America, Northern America, of course, and in Europe, with a little bit in Australia as well. Now, the European and North American fossil records effectively represent the fact that these parts of the globe have been so well documented in terms of paleontology, in terms of geology, in terms of research, that we have a really good understanding of what's there. We know what the rocks are, and we know what's in the rocks. Other parts of the world, such as Africa, such as South America, such as New Zealand, for example, we don't have a very long record of examination. And therefore, by extension, we don't have a very good record of what has been there and what could have been there. So further examination of these areas on the globe is probably going to help us fill in certain gaps in terms of the evolution of horseshoe crabs. So moving on, so that's basically the background of what I'm going to be talking about. There are three main points of the animal that I want you guys to keep in mind while I'm talking about these things. So a horseshoe crab fundamentally can be split up into three main sections. So you have the prosoma, which is basically the head, like all the fun stuff happens up here. Eyes, brain, walking legs, things that do chewing, all that is there. The thoracotron, which is basically the butt end. So where the breathing apparatus, where the anus are, and then the talson, which is pretty much like a tail, which is used in righting the animal if it turns itself upside down, and very little else really. So I want you to keep these in mind, because as I talk about these different animals and the evolutionary history of horseshoe crabs, these terms are going to come up a little bit. All right. Before we dive into the what we call the taxonomy or the science of putting things in certain boxes, though, I want to make this particular point clear. As those of you who study horseshoe crabs will know, they're not actually crabs. It is what we call a misnomer. That the name itself harkens back to a point in time where the idea of something marine being related to spiders and scorpions was just outlandish. No one could consider it. Despite the fact that horseshoe crabs have a lot more legs than crustaceans do. Nonetheless, they were effectively put in the same box as crustaceans, and the name has effectively permeated through into the modern literature, and even though it's the wrong term to be using, it's what we refer to them as. The group that horseshoe crabs fall into, the taxonomic group, is what we call Xiphusura or Xiphusuridae, if you want to be a little more specific. As I mentioned before, they are kind of like in the family tree that is arthropods. Horseshoe crabs are kind of like the cousin to scorpions and spiders, and they're like real distant cousins to crustaceans and insects. And these animals have a lovely fossil record, as I mentioned. The fossil record that really extends through almost all of the Phanerozoic. So this is a figure that I've ripped out of a paper of mine that kind of shows you, don't worry about the names or anything. It's more important to consider the distribution through time. What this shows you is that extending all the way into the Ordovician, these animals have survived, have diversified, have done a whole bunch of different things across their evolutionary history. And across this, an array of distinct morphologies and forms have arisen. And often these different forms, these different shapes reflect different environments. So these animals that we see today that are almost exclusively marine, with the exception of Carcinosaurus, which is a little bit strange. It's a little bit sort of marginal marine in terms of parts of its life. But these animals basically have explored a whole bunch of different environments at different points of the last 500 million years, which have then resulted in a whole bunch of different shapes that basically constitute that which is horseshoe crabs. And that's what I'm really going to go into here today. So, cast your mind back to a time when vertebrates weren't even thought about. The lowest Paleozoic, the lowest Ordovician, is a time when animals and animal diversity was dominated by arthropods. And we have two kinds of horseshoe crabs that we saw at this point. These animals were exclusively marine. There was no terrestrial on land component to them. They lived within the ocean. That was it. So we have Lunataspis here, and we have a organism from Morocco that's yet to be formally written up. But they look generally similar. You can see the three main sections. You have the prosoma, the thorastron, and the telson. So similar here, prosoma, thorastron, telson. But we see there are some fundamental differences. All right, so the thorastron in particular, you see these sorts of divisions along the thoracotron. That tells you that these animals, they had expression of certain components of their butt end that has since been fused together. And if you look at the head, now these animals have a lot more sort of roundish looking prosomal sections, whereas today horseshoe crabs look like modern horseshoe crabs. Their head looks like a horseshoe, where they get their name. So this was really the origin of these animals. And look how far they've come. As we then take a step into the Middle Paleozoic, into the Devonian, of course, is the time that you may refer to as the age of fish, where large armored fish were starting to dominate the oceans. Horseshoe crabs were there as well. Now, they looked a bit different. A lot more obvious expression of the thoracotron here. The prosoma is starting to look kind of like a horseshoe, but doesn't have that nice extension that we see in modern day horseshoe crabs. They have a distribution of basically within the States and Australia. So this one, and this one are found in the United States. And this boy here, Carboniferous, is found in Australia. We don't really know how they fit into the grand scheme of horseshoe crab evolution, if they are kind of intermediate forms. They're sort of filled in between those older forms and what we're about to talk about, or if they're kind of a weird evolutionary offshoot that didn't really make it very far. We don't really know. And part of it's because of the environmental range in which they lived in. They lived in marine and marginal marine environments. And this means that how they were living is starting to get a little bit strange relative to their origin in the Ordovician. Now, I'm going to take a leap forward in time into the Carboniferous. Carboniferous is a period of time where there were huge insects. We're talking dragonflies that were a meter long. We're talking about millipedes that were like 1.5 meters long. These were amazingly huge terrestrial organisms. They had trees that were many, 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 meters tall. This was a very amazing time to be an invertebrate, an arthropod specifically. Horseshoe crabs, of course, had to do something completely strange because that's how they happen to do in their evolutionary history. And what they did is they did one of two things. They either got really spiny, so like this Paleozoic here, we see the general spines starting to extend all the way down there, or they just decided to do absolutely nothing spiky and be two complete blobs like these two. So Prolimulus and Linonaspis. Basically, this reflects a what we call heterochrony. So heterochrony is more or less changing of timing in development during ontogeny, where certain different things get expressed at different times. Juvenile horseshoe crabs kind of look like two blobs put together. And so what we think happened here is that in the Carboniferous with Paleozoics, the certain genetic things got turned off. And so they stopped actually developing during their ontogeny. They stopped basically at the childhood stage, but then kept growing so that they maintained these childhood shapes, but and becoming adults still looked like child morphologies. At the same time as those very, very, very strange horseshoe crabs were wandering around in freshwater environments, we had the Paleozoic. Sorry, 2 seconds. My cat wants to go out. She's bugging me. Excuse me. Of course, the moment she wants to go out and I let the door open, she doesn't want to go out. So that's fun. Awesome. Anyway, moving on. So in the Carboniferous, as I mentioned, we have the Paleozoics, weird morphologies, and then we have the Paleolithic. So when you look at these animals, of which this one is currently being described by myself, they look like modern horseshoe crabs, right? So you've got the genal spines that extend down. You have a thoracic that kind of has that really trapezoidal shape to it. And then you have the nice elongate telson. But there are some differences, right? So we're still seeing segmentation of the thoracitron here, not so much in this guy, but at least in these guys, we do see that. And the actual shape of them, because of that segmentation, looks a little bit strange relative to modern forms. But these are really getting into what we consider to be logically considered to be horseshoe crabs. And it's quite possible that these animals actually laid the groundwork for modern horseshoe crabs. Now, into the Permian. The Permian, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, is kind of the time period where the domain of arthropods kind of got shut down because of a certain extinction event. But we begin to see in horseshoe crabs the rise of animals that look really weird. Okay. Equally weird as the Paleozoics. So we have things like this. This is Tasmania limulus from Tasmania of Australia, where they have really long spines on them. You have Russian forms that have really, really big prosoma and small thoracitrons, and similar here with the American forms. So these are animals that lived in freshwater environments. They're what we call the Australomulids. And effectively what constitutes these animals is either the hyperdevelopment, so making something really big, or the reduction of exoskeletal features. As to where and why and how these animals arose, we're not quite sure. They may have been an offshoot from the Paleozoics. They may have been their own entire evolutionary trajectory. We don't really know. What we do know is that they began to colonize freshwater environments. And that's really key for the next step. So the Triassic is the period just after this mass extinction. 95% of all marine animals have gone extinct. 70% of terrestrial animals have gone extinct. The world is basically on fire. The oceans are completely acidic. And it's really not a fun time if you're living in the oceans. What horseshoe crabs did is they colonized freshwater environments in the Permian. So whatever was on in rivers, lakes at that time, basically gave rise to these sorts of animals. My all-time favorite horseshoe crab is this guy here, Australimulus. It looks like a pickaxe. I mean, you know, it's got 2 points and I suppose a handle to it. It's crazy. This is just an insane horseshoe crab. These are animals that they defy the imagination in the context of modern forms. But the occupation of freshwater environments allowed these animals to recover from this extinction. I would argue that if they hadn't had a foray into living in rivers or closer to the land in general than modern forms do, they probably would have completely gone extinct. So we are really lucky that they did that. The other thing about the Triassic is there were two families that lived at that point. Two families, when I mean families in the taxonomic context, it's the group that collates all animals that look generally quite similar. So you have family, genus, and species. So we have Limulidae, which is the group that contains modern horseshoe crabs, and Australimulidae, these weird, crazy forms. So we had two major groups of horseshoe crabs living at the same time. It was probably the best time on Earth, in Earth's history, to be a horseshoe crab. This was the heyday in which horseshoe crabs did all kinds of evolutionary innovation. It was beautiful. We then step forward into the Jurassic. Now, you probably will know the Jurassic from the movie Jurassic Park. It is the time period where dinosaurs were the roaming dominant titans on Earth, or after a while at this point had really become kind of like second-class citizens in comparison to our lovely dinosaurs. Horseshoe crabs, of course, were there as well. We have horseshoe crabs that were chilling at the same time that dinosaurs walking around. Now, the Jurassic and then into modern day horseshoe crabs have very little difference in terms of their shape and their size. Well, their shape specifically, size is different, sorry. So this guy, Miscellaneous from the Solnhofen limestone in Germany, where they found Archaeopteryx, looks pretty much like a modern day horseshoe crab. Similar shape, similar spikiness, no expression of spines, of tergites, sections, on the thoracotron. It looks like a modern day horseshoe crab. The one difference is these animals are still pretty small by comparison to something like Tachypleus tridentatus. That gets up to 1 meter, 1.5 meters. These are maybe 20 to 30 centimeters long. So the main difference that's happened since the Jurassic has been an increase in size. And of course, here we are back in our modern horseshoe crabs. We can see immediately these things look so comparable to those fossil forms from the Jurassic specifically. Now, to take a more statistical perspective on this evolutionary history is work that I've done with colleagues of mine interested in understanding how horseshoe crabs have survived and what they've done. Don't worry so much about how we got this data. It's a bunch of crazy mathematics and a lot of time. But what it shows you is that in terms of the amount of shape, the amount of stuff that's going on, the Carboniferous and the Triassic were the two main periods in which there was just a whole bunch of weirdness. And this makes sense, right? We saw the Baleonierids animals that have spikes like that, but also they look like two blobs. And in the Triassic, we see animals like limulus, and we see animals that look like a pickaxe. These are animals that have two distinct places in what we call morphospace. Now, what is really interesting is when we look at the green, which is limulus, the modern horseshoe crabs. The shape space has basically been the same since the Triassic. These animals pretty much perfected how to build a horseshoe crab as far back as just after the end Permian extinction. So they've been doing survival for that period of time, which I think is absolutely brilliant. All right, so hopefully some of that made some sense. That was kind of a rough and ready run through on the evolution of horseshoe crabs and how they've come to be where they are, as well as being interrupted by my cat. Once again, I apologize for that. We're now going to transition to talk a little bit about conservation and how I got to be interested in conservation, and how we can use some unfortunate specimens to actually help these animals. So, injuries. Injuries are crazy. You get all sorts of forms. You get mad gashes removed. You get really crazily bent telsons like this. You get bumps and you get sections removed. And it can happen on juveniles, it can happen on adults, you can observe them in molts. And basically all components of a horseshoe crab's exoskeleton in modern ecology, you can see some kind of injury. And the expression ranges from being very, very minute, you have to be quite attuned to what you're looking at, to a complete removal of the telson. They are really underexplored, though. Injuries give you an opportunity to understand how these animals are built to survive certain almost catastrophic events. So this particular specimen, so this is the same individual, just that one has molted from this one. Now, this one didn't have a telson. The telson was completely lopped off. And my colleague, Dorcas, who's a German colleague who works in Indonesia, during her master's found this. So she labeled this guy, molted. They found the same individual a year later and the telson had completely recovered. There's still a little kink to it there, but basically these animals can recover from pretty traumatic injuries, which is amazing. We didn't know if horseshoe crabs could do this. Now there is evidence that they can. If you want to look at the pattern of injuries, this is what also work I've done with Dorcas and Mark Botton, and a colleague of mine, Steve Pates, and one of Mark's students. We see that in terms of percentage abundance, we look at two really iconic horseshoe crabs, the American horseshoe crab and Antechypleus tridentatus from Indonesia. We see that the head section, the prosoma of Limulus, is more commonly damaged than Antechypleus, but then the thoracotron in Antechypleus abundantly has a lot more damage. Now, this particular pattern led us to consider the possibility that these animals that are living in entirely different parts of the globe are being subject to different kinds of pressures. Not that of predation, but of human-related pressures. Limulus that lives in certain parts of the US, with the exception of it being harvested for blood, isn't really subject to any kind of bycatch, because no one really wants to go looking for fish in the New York River. That's kind of gross. Whereas in Indonesia, of course, they're being more impacted by human interactions, which may have resulted in this difference. Looking at size patterns, this is work that I've done with the lovely Swati on Carcinorscorpius. We see that injured and non-injured male and female individuals kind of follow the same pattern, but there is a minimum size at which we see injured specimens. So at a point, either they don't survive some kind of injury or they're simply not injured. But once we do start seeing injured individuals, there are two main points that we see that are different. The terrestrial is generally a bit smaller than non-injured individuals, so it has a lot more of a constrained pattern there. And the prosoma, for some reason, is a little bit larger. Now, what that means is kind of hard to say. It could be that, unfortunately, the ones that have a slightly larger head are more subject to bycatch, or unfortunately are more often interacted with by humans. Nonetheless, what this pattern shows us is that we know that there are certain groups within modern horseshoe crabs that are being subject to injuries, and that injuries can be used to help us effectively conserve these animals. Before I go into the applications of what I just said, we also see injuries in the fossil record. So Mesolimulus up the top here, Euprops down the bottom here, two different periods of time, 150 million years ago, 310 million years ago. We see the same kind of indentations that we see in modern forms. That tells us that injuries in horseshoe crabs have consistently been there across time. So we're not looking at freak evidence in modern horseshoe crabs, but the fact that we have an inflated abundance, these two fossils are incredibly rare. I've looked at least 300 specimens of this guy and at least 200 of this. The fact that I've only found one of each tells you that horseshoe crabs weren't that commonly injured in their fossil ecosystems. So modern ecosystems really are the problem here. And of course, unfortunately, we can kind of blame humans for that a little bit. So, as I mentioned, we can blame humans. There's another explanation, which is predation. Now, horseshoe crabs in the modern ecosystems aren't really subject to that much predation. Nothing really wants to eat horseshoe crabs. Humans don't want to eat horseshoe crabs. Nothing does. They don't really have much good about them. So in the modern systems, when we're looking at injuries, what we're probably looking at is human interaction or human-induced interaction, which is to say that humans have introduced certain animals to certain ecosystems that have negatively impacted horseshoe crabs and the associated environment that these animals live in. But can we do anything with that observation? Well, the answer is yes, emphatically. And it's something that I really think we need to be doing on a regular basis, on a yearly basis. So if you sample population of horseshoe crabs wherever you are in the world on a yearly basis, and you frequently observe a large number of injuries, like a number of injuries relative to normal specimens that just seems out of the normal, 1 in 2 individuals are injured, that's telling you something's wrong with that system. There is something that is negatively impacting these animals that needs to be addressed. This, of course, allows you to question what is doing it. Work that Swati presented includes the observation that humans treat horseshoe crabs effectively as bycatch. They negatively interact with any of ruminants that are introduced to certain parts of India, of the mangroves there, and that humans will sometimes collect them for, I suppose, keepsakes. These sorts of interactions negatively impact the way that horseshoe crabs are able to reproduce and survive. What this means is that injuries, if we gather enough data, can be used as an indicator of poor population conditions. And that if we are able to determine that these animals are being subject to poor population conditions, we can then start to really present solid arguments for conservation efforts in order to prevent them from going extinct, which ultimately is what we want, right? Is animals that have survived 5 mass extinctions, they shouldn't be made extinct by us. And so, as far as I'm concerned, we can use these almost unfortunate individuals as a way of determining how we can help horseshoe crabs survive humans and to continue to prosper. All right. Well, that's my talk. I'd just like to thank a few people, my research fund at UNE here, my colleagues from all corners of the globe, from Russia to India, to the US, to New Zealand. I thank them all for their support, their willingness to talk to me about these sorts of problems. My mentors in my work, people who supervise me, people who still supervise me, they have driven me and helped me develop into the person that I am. The museum staff, the museums I've visited to help develop these sorts of projects, I thoroughly thank them. Swati and Nature Mates, I really want to thank you both from the bottom of my heart for being invited to talk. It's such an honor to be invited to talk about these group of animals that I care so much about. And I'm really sure that I missed someone in all of that. But for now, that's all I'm going to thank. So thank you all very much. And I'm gonna stop screen sharing, hopefully. There we go. Awesome. Thank you very much. Any questions? Maybe. No. Maybe, yes.
It's a wonderful talk. There was a link issue. So it's a wonderful talk, and I would like to ask all the participants whether they have any questions for Russell.
Absolutely.
You are most welcome to drop your questions in the chat box, or you can ask directly.
Arjun, I've got a question for Russell.
Sure.
Yeah. Hi, Russell. This is Anirban. Basically, as these are like very prehistoric creatures, as you already mentioned, I would just like to know that what is the largest, ancestor size of the horseshoe crabs? Because in prehistoric times, we have seen like large turtles, large crocodilians, large snakes, dragonflies. I mean, something like the Jurassic World. So, what is like the largest that you have come across, or like the record exists?
So, in modern forms, you have the largest horseshoe crabs. So the Chinese and the Japanese horseshoe crabs are emphatically the largest, on the order of 1 meter to 1.5 meters long. In the fossil record, I would say there are fossils from Germany, from what we call the Neogene of Germany, so about 15 million years ago, fairly recently. And they are up to 1 meter, maybe 1 meter in total length. But in modern forms represent the largest horseshoe crabs. The reason why they aren't nearly as large as what we see as the dragonflies and the millipedes of the Carboniferous is because those animals lived on land. There was an abundance of oxygen. And when you have an increased amount of oxygen, things tend to get pretty large. Horseshoe crabs don't really work with oxygen so well. They have gills that allow them to breathe. But in terms of actually interacting with free oxygen, they don't really do that. So because they are effectively aquatic animals, they didn't get that sort of influence that dragonflies did. But lovely question. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you too.
Hi, Russell. Atindra has a question. Sir, what can be the main cause of explosion of horseshoe crabs population in the Triassic period?
It's actually a topic that I'm actually working on right now myself. And it's really quite important, I think, to understand extinction and recovery in modern and extinct ecosystems. So when you remove 95% of all animals on Earth, if you did that today, there would be a whole bunch of what we call vacant ecosystem, vacant niches. And animals that are able to survive into these into this new world, this brand new world, they can then colonize those niches by effectively tweaking how they do what they do. So in the Triassic, because basically everything went extinct, horseshoe crabs were able to basically say, well, I'm here now, let's just go bananas and do as much as we can and just do a whole bunch of really crazy stuff. And that's how they were able to recover. They're also a really resilient animal in general, and that resilience really led them to being so effective at surviving those sorts of extinctions and then recovering after it. But beautiful question, thank you.
Dr. Anil Kumar has a question. For which purposes horseshoe crabs are killed? I have seen selling it for some types of traditional medicine.
None. They shouldn't be. I'm sorry. Horseshoe crab, or at least limulus, is collected for its blood, which we know is important in vaccines. But now there are actually modern synthetic variations that do the same thing. I'm not certain if the 3 Asian horseshoe crab species that the blood can be synthesized in a similar way. I think I read at one point there were problems in trying to do the same pattern, or the same synthetic approach from the blood. So in terms of horseshoe crabs from Asia, there is no need for them to be killed at all. They can't be used in anything. In fact, eating them can make you very ill. I suppose if you really wanted, you could turn them into some kind of gift or something, but even then you might as well just collect a molted individual. They just, yeah, they don't need to be killed at all as far as I'm concerned. Any more questions?
Hello, Russell. This is Proshenji. So, as you told, there was a shift between the habitat choice, like to avoid the mass extinction, they occupied the fresh water, and that made them successful for the time period. So, in an overall sense, like, is there any record that there was a shift from terrestrial habitat to aquatic habitat? Not for only the horseshoe crabs, but overall invertebrates. They shifted from terrestrial habitat to aquatic, or vice versa, to avoid this kind of mass extinction or all. So there is any record or something?
Well, so big question. We'll start with horseshoe crabs. In as much as I know, they've never fully terrestrialized. They don't have the toolkit to be terrestrial. They're not like spiders or scorpions. They can't breathe free oxygen. So that pattern has never happened. Furthermore, the origin of life is in the ocean, not on land. So I suppose, inverse terrestrialization hasn't happened. In terms of animals that have become terrestrial and then colonized marine conditions, there are, off the top of my head, I would say hexapods are a good example of that. So insects can at least partly inhabit certain freshwater conditions. To become marine requires a fairly resourceful set of building blocks. You need to be able to deal with fluctuations in salinity. You need to be able to capitalize on fairly unpleasant environments. I'm not certain of any group that have successfully done that. I know there are isopods, which are a kind of crustacean that have marine and terrestrial forms, but I think they were marine to start off with, and then some of them became terrestrial, as opposed to the opposite process.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Anything more?
Does anybody else have any question?
Maybe not.
Well, Russell, I would like to really thank you for, taking time out today, because it was really interesting. I honestly had no idea that horseshoe crabs could regenerate parts of their body. Like, it's amazing to know that. So, and it was really interesting. I hope our talk today leads to some future collaborative work with our organization, because it would be really nice to host you out here in Sundarbans and something about the work we are doing there. So thank you so much for attending this session today, and I would like to thank all our participants, and obviously Shati for coordinating the entire thing. And yeah, so I would like to, and we are circulating a I think a form. Please fill it up, because we would like to get your feedback from this webinar. So yeah.
If I can have 2 seconds, I would just like to thank you all for attending. Thank you all for your insightful questions. And yeah, thank once again, Nature Mates, for setting this up. It is my honor and my privilege to be able to speak to you about these animals. So thank you once again from the bottom of my heart. I really do appreciate it.
I guess this concludes